So today I'm going to present some general ideas about how domestic politics affect war. And the idea is then to explain how these general ideas might help us better understand the current Russia-Ukraine war. And that is, what we do in political science is we try to develop general theories and then apply them to specific circumstances. Especially, I'm going to focus on how democracies fight wars differently from authoritarian states. Now, let me say at the outset, of course, all of you know much more about Russia, Ukraine, and the current war than me. So please feel free to correct me in the question and answer period if I get any specifics incorrect. I'll be focusing more about general matters. Okay, so for a long time, we have tried to understand how a state's internal political system, what sort of regime it has, might affect its foreign policy and also affect the way that that state fights its wars. And this is something that the ancient Greeks thought about, many Western philosophers wrote about, philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, Alexis de Tocqueville, and many others. And a key comparison is between how democracies might make foreign policy and fight wars differently from authoritarian states. Now, one very simple point is that democratic leaders, they have to pay attention to whether or not their policy choices will be popular. In a democracy, if the leader makes an unpopular choice, she might be voted out of power. And this is something we are currently observing in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Truss made some unpopular choices for economic policy, and she may be removed from power. And because democratic leaders like to stay in power, they like to avoid making decisions which will be unpopular. So, for example, both presidents, Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the United States, understood that sending troops abroad, American troops abroad, would be unpopular, and so have stayed away from intervening in the civil war in Syria, sending more troops to the civil war in Syria. And the photo in front of you is a photo of the Syrian civil war. Now, in contrast, in authoritarian states, an authoritarian leader can more easily crack down on dissent. So a dictator is less concerned if he makes a policy choice that is unpopular, because an unpopular policy choice is less likely to lead to the dictator being overthrown. So I have a map here of Iraq, and the example is Saddam Hussein, the former dictator of Iraq. He launched two disastrous invasions of his neighbors, invading Iran in 1980 and Kuwait in 1990. Both wars went very badly and were unpopular, but Saddam Hussein was able to remain in power after the wars because he was able to successfully crack down on dissent and crush opposition. Now, one implication of this, and this was a point made by Immanuel Kant in the 1790s, is that maybe the world would be more peaceful if the world was filled with democracies. And the idea is that citizens don't like wars because the people bear the costs of war and higher taxes and war deaths. And so this becomes an incentive for democratic leaders to avoid all wars. okay? And this is sometimes referred to as the democratic peace, that we can make the world more peaceful if the world becomes more democratic. This idea was first emerged in the 1700s. It reemerged in various points in the 20th century. It became a motivation for example, expanding NATO to some East European countries in the 1990s. The thought being this would help make Eastern Europe more peaceful if we could help Eastern Europe remain democratic. The Bush administration eventually said around 2004 that one motivation for the 2003 Iraq War is that if the world community could help Iraq become democratic, then this might make the entire Middle Eastern region more peaceful. Okay, so that's a proposition. Now, however, one flaw in this proposition, or one puzzle, is that yes, democracies may be more peaceful. The public doesn't like war. And sometimes the spread of democracy to a region does help that region become more democratic. Perhaps one example is the spread of democracy to Western Europe after World War II. That helped eliminate the threat of war between France and Germany, for example. However, we do notice that sometimes democracies become involved in wars. And sometimes it's not just the cases of peace-loving democracies like Ukraine being attacked, but sometimes democracies actually start wars. They actually begin wars. And so I have a few examples on the slide. Israel attacks its Arab neighbors in 1956, 67, and 1982. India attacks Pakistan in 1971. And the United States chose to go to war in 1991 to liberate Kuwait. So this is it is what we sometimes we call a puzzle, right? We have a very logical democratic peace thesis that democracies would seem to want to avoid war, but at least some of the time, democracies are willing to choose war. They are willing to start wars. So what's going on here? Let's see if we can think about why this puzzle is occurring, or try to solve this puzzle. Okay, so here is one way to think about it, okay? One way to think about it is that democratic governments, democratic leaders, are more willing to start wars if they think the war will be popular, if they think that the population will support the war. And so then the next question we might say is, well, okay, fair point, but under what conditions will a democratic public, be more likely to support a war? And we might say, it's relatively straightforward conditions. So democratic populations are more willing to start wars if the war is for a popular cause, something the public supports, if the war seems like it will be low cost and will be short, and if it appears that the democracy will win the war. So for example, in 1991, US President George Bush authorized the war to liberate Kuwait. And this was popular for the American public. It was for a good cause, to fight aggression and to maintain world access to Persian Gulf oil. President Bush was confident that the United States would win the war. And President Bush was confident that the war would be over quickly and would be at low cost. Okay, and all of these things came to pass. The coalition won the war with low cost, relatively quickly. And, for a variety of reasons, it was seen as a war that was worth fighting. And so as a result, President Bush's popularity increased after the Gulf War because it was popular. So at least some of the time, there are conditions under which the public will, a democratic public, excuse me, will support going to war. Okay. Now, on the other side, authoritarian leaders, dictators, they think about starting wars differently. So one point is that they are more confident that they will be able to stay in power even if they start wars that are unpopular. Okay. And that is, even if the war goes poorly and it's unpopular amongst the population, then the authoritarian leader is more confident that he or she will be able to stay in power by using repression. Okay. So as a result, authoritarian leaders are more willing to take risks. They're more willing to start wars, even if they are not highly confident they will win, because they know that even if the war goes poorly, then they will still be able to stay in power. And one thing that we know about dictators is that the thing that they value more than anything else is staying in political power. So one way to think about it is, in sort of a general way, is all leaders, when they are considering whether or not to start a war, they ask a very simple question: what is our likelihood of winning? Is it 90%, 60%, 50%? And the idea here is that democracies are more likely to start a war only when they are very confident they will win, maybe 90% chance of winning or higher. They avoid risks. And dictators are more willing to start wars even when the chance of winning, their own assessment, might be lower, maybe more like 60%. They are willing to embrace significant risks. And so as a result, we would see that democracies are probably more likely going to win the wars that they start as opposed to authoritarian states. There's one more element I would like to introduce, which is that when authoritarian leaders are considering whether or not to start a war, they are more likely to have false confidence that they will win. They are more likely to be misinformed about their true likelihood of winning. And this is there's sort of a complicated process, not complicated, but slightly more nuanced process. Okay, so dictators very much fear losing power because when a dictator loses power, there's a risk that he or she may be put in jail or executed. And dictators are especially worried about being overthrown in a military coup d'etat, a military revolution. So dictators take steps to reduce the risks of being overthrown in a coup. One of the things that they do is they make sure they are surrounded by military leaders who are politically loyal. So they're more likely to promote those leaders who will support the dictator no matter what, who will tell the dictator whatever he wants to hear, rather than promoting military leaders who are not political and are military professionals. So the dynamic is that a dictator will say to his leaders, if we start this war that I'm considering, do you think that we will win? And for a dictator, his military advisors are more likely to say, oh, yes, of course you will win. Under your brilliant leadership, how could we lose? Because of course they have an incentive not to disagree with the dictator, because advisors who disagree with dictators suffer terrible fates. They become purged. Another dynamic is that within dictatorships, there is not free speech or free debate within public society. So you do not have people outside of government openly expressing their views as to whether or not starting a war is a good idea. Professors, journalists, experts, and so forth. So the leader does not have the benefit of open debate about whether or not a particular policy is going to go well. Whereas in democracies, there is this open debate and people can talk about whether or not a particular potential war might be a good idea. So let me give you one example of this. As many of you are probably aware, in the 1930s, the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union engaged in widespread purges. Of course, there was great suffering in Ukraine itself. And in addition, Stalin purged military and political leaders of anyone who he perceived might be politically disloyal. They were executed or sent to labor camps, okay? And as a result, he surrounded himself with military leaders who were not professionally competent and also were not going to give their honest opinions. They were more likely to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear. And so in fall of 1939, Stalin was making territorial demands of Finland. Finland refused to make these concessions, and Stalin decided to order a Soviet invasion of Finland, confident in rapid victory. Okay, and as many of you may know, this war went very, very poorly for the Red Army. They suffered very significant losses. And so one of the reasons, there's this puzzle, like, why do countries start wars that go poorly, don't go as well as as the leaders think they would? One reason is that dictators don't get quality information as to their likelihood of succeeding. And as I said, democracies are more likely to get better information. Now, in my research, I look at this not in the context just of a single conflict, but the span of history. And if you look at the last 2 centuries since the Napoleonic Wars, it is the case that when democracies start wars, they are much more likely to win than when dictatorships start wars. So we have kind of systematic evidence, that democratic leaders are better informed. They can avoid wars which are likely going to go poorly, and they don't like taking risks. So they're only going to start wars when they're confident they're going to win. Now, that being said, it's certainly the case that sometimes democracies make mistakes. They start wars that don't go well, and they start wars when they maybe based on false confidence. In my own country, we often point to the Vietnam War as a good example of America, a democracy, choosing to get involved in a war that we don't win. But the way to think about it is we're looking for general patterns. Even if there are exceptions, what is the general pattern? It's sort of like, if we're relatively confident that smoking causes cancer, and perhaps you have a 90-year-old uncle who's been smoking his whole life and has lived to be 90, just because there is one old person who smokes, it doesn't mean that in general smoking is not bad for your health, right? So yes, there are some exceptions, as there is with anything, but we can still look at the general patterns. Okay, so that's research I've been doing. These are some general ideas. And now what I would like to do, and in the question and answer period, you may disagree or want to engage, which would be great. I want to think about how some of these patterns might help us understand the Russia-Ukraine war. And in my view, domestic politics within Russia probably did play an important role in explaining why Russia started this war. Okay, so first, I don't think I need to tell you that by 2021, the regime within Russia led by Vladimir Putin was a dictatorship. As many of you know, I'm sure, after Putin took power in 2000, he steadily destroyed the democratic institutions that had begun to emerge under Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s. And as I'm sure you all know, in the decades that followed, Putin isolated, imprisoned, or executed political opponents and independent journalists. He also steadily destroyed the independence of the Russian parliament and Russian courts. Also, as I'm sure you know, he built a cult of personality around himself. I'm sure you've seen these laughable images of him without a shirt, hunting, playing hockey, these kinds of things, which seem very strange to non-Russians. They seem almost laughable, but it's part of the classic thing that dictators do, is to build the cult of personality. Now, there are, of course, Russian oligarchs, very rich Russian business people. But what has become evident is that those oligarchs probably do not have very much political power. They don't really have much ability to control Putin. Occasionally, an oligarch will speak out against Putin, as Mikhail Khodorkovsky did in 2001. But when they have been put in jail or exiled, and they've not been able to mount, from what we can see, any kind of political opposition to Putin, certainly not publicly, and perhaps not privately as well. Okay, so how have Russian politics, the dictatorship within Russia, how did it affect Russia's decision to start the war? And so here, let's think about maybe three different factors. One is that Putin does not have to worry too much about domestic political opposition, certainly much less than an elected leader. He's already eliminated opposition political parties and politicians. He obviously has a powerful internal security police, and this has allowed him to crush opposition and to control the media. Okay, and certainly when the war started, Putin was probably very confident of his ability to crush any dissent, and that led him to be willing to start a risky war, knowing that even if the war went poorly, he would be able to stay in power. Now, as we have seen, even those of us outside of Russia in the last few weeks, that as the war has gone steadily more poorly for Russia, we're beginning to see various forms of opposition and dissent within Russia. Certainly not widespread movements quite yet, but more protests and some independent voices speaking out. And that, speaks to the point that dictators can more easily control public dissent as compared to elected leaders, but their control is not infinite. They do not have magical powers to maintain control in their societies, and sometimes even the most repressive leaders can lose power. Okay. So one point that probably motivated Russia's decision to invade the war was that he felt confident he could repress any opposition. A second point is that Putin was probably misinformed about how easy it would be to conquer Ukraine. Okay. Like almost all dictators, Putin got rid of anyone within the Russian government or military who might threaten him. And he kept himself very isolated to facilitate his political control. And this is an image, perhaps a famous image you've seen of Putin at a conference table where he is literally several meters away from other people in the meeting, which just represents his disconnection from his advisors. And, you know, the people around Putin are politically loyal, and they were probably very unlikely to question Putin's assumption that the war would be easily won. You can imagine the conversations of Putin saying things like, I would like to invade Ukraine. I think that, you know, the Red Army will very easily defeat the Ukrainians. And his leaders would say, of course, under your leadership, how can they not fail? And he was not given accurate information as to how difficult this war might actually be. And then a third point I want to make about the regime is this, that because Putin controls the media, it has been easier for him to create a narrative within society about why Russia needs to invade Ukraine. And this is just a cartoon from the Russian media, which I found. And so Putin has been able to sort of sell this tale that Ukraine is a pawn of NATO, that NATO is trying to use Ukraine as a stepping stone to invade Russia. Ukraine is controlled by Nazis. I don't need to tell you how preposterous these claims are, but for Putin, his ability to control the media and even Russian schools has made it easier for him to convince the population that this war is necessary. It's not a war of imperial aggression, but it's a war of security needed to defend Russia itself. And of course, if you can convince the population that a war is necessary and it's for defensive purposes, the war will be more popular. Now, that said, there are three other dimensions of Russian politics I would like to highlight that help explain why Russian forces have fought so badly after the war started. So one point is that Russia is a deeply corrupt society. This is a country which is held together by corruption, by illegal payoffs, by illegal deals and so forth. And what became evident after the war started is that this widespread corruption within Russian society has undermined Russian military power in very specific ways. And I'm going to tell you things that I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with from having followed the war so closely, of course, and experienced the war. And it's things like that Russian tanks were not maintained properly during peacetime. They were given low quality tires, the batteries weren't maintained, things like this, because, you know, the contracts to maintain the tanks were given on the basis of corruption, and the work paid for was not actually done. We also see things like Russian troops have not been supplied properly. They don't have the right clothing, they don't have the right shoes, they don't have enough food. All of these kinds of things that are essential to the basic operations of a military, you know, the Russian military does not have. One Western analyst referred to the Russian military as a Potemkin village, which perhaps some of you are familiar with that literary reference, can see that means sort of a hollow shell or sort of a pretense, and there's nothing behind the facade. You know, one broader point I would make is that this dynamic of corruption inside of authoritarian states, we see it sometimes in other militaries. So for example, during the Vietnam War, the government in South Vietnam was authoritarian and deeply corrupt. And that corruption substantially undermined the ability of the South Vietnamese military to fight effectively. Okay, So that's kind of one point about one point. A second point is that when dictators fear being overthrown by the military, as Putin is because he's a dictator, then one thing they do is they centralize military command. They maintain very tight control over the command within the military, and they do not give lower level commanders much ability to make independent choices on the battlefield. And, this restricts the strategy options that militaries have. It makes them less innovative. They're less able to adapt and less able to take advantage of emerging opportunities on the battlefield. And this is one reason why the Arab armies under authoritarian governments have fought very poorly against Israel, which is a democratic government, and one reason why Iraq fought so poorly against the United States in 1991. And certainly, this has been a huge gap between the performance of Russian forces and Ukrainian forces. The Russian forces have exhibited a lot of rigidity, lack of initiative, and Ukrainian troops have shown a lot more initiative and flexibility, which has helped them adapt on the battlefield. A third point I want to make about politics affecting the way the war is fought has to do with the behavior of Russian troops. Okay. Now, in general, authoritarian armies are less likely than the armies of democracies to obey the laws of war. And by that, I mean to not brutalize civilians, to treat prisoners respectfully, and so forth. Now, I certainly don't need to tell you that the Russian military has behaved atrociously during this war in its treatment both of Ukrainian civilians and of Ukrainian prisoners. Now, the world community talks about this as a war crime and as something which is morally terrible. But what I would tell you is that this is also very bad military strategy. Okay, that the worse that the more the Russian army mistreats Ukrainian civilians, the more likely they are to resist occupation. And that just very straightforwardly undermines the ability of the Russian army to function. The worse that the Russian army treats Ukrainian prisoners, the less likely Ukrainian soldiers are to surrender and to fight with great bravery, even risking their own lives. And this is one of the reasons that Ukrainians have been able to, from what I've read as an outsider, I mean, you obviously know much better than me, one of the reasons that Ukrainian troops have been so effective at destroying Russian tanks is the willingness of Ukrainian soldiers to put themselves in danger by getting relatively close to Russian tanks within a few hundred meters to then use British and American supplied anti-tank weapons. But that, I mean, yes, the NATO military technology is helpful, but it only works when coupled with great Ukrainian troop bravery. Okay, and one of the reasons the Ukrainian troops are fighting with such great bravery is because they do not want to be captured because they are very fearful they will be treated very poorly. So the point being is that violating the laws of war is not only immoral, it also is poor strategy. And this is something which has occurred in the past. In World War II, for example, once it became evident in the Pacific that Japanese troops were mistreating American troops who had been captured, then American troops started fighting with greater bravery in battle. Okay. Kind of a last point, and then we'll open it up for questions, I suppose. How do Russian domestic politics, how might they affect the end of the war? This is very difficult to say. the current Ukrainian offensive is putting pressure on Putin. His decision to conscript Russian men more broadly has gone very poorly. The war is becoming unpopular, more unpopular within Russia. And there are some signs of opposition. I don't think we would see a mass revolution against Putin like in 1917, but it's becoming somewhat more possible that we might see sort of a bloodless coup, like the removal of Khrushchev in 1964 or Gorbachev in 1992, where behind the scenes, some political elites persuade Putin to step down. Okay. And then, what I want to close with this sort of thinking about, what lies ahead for Ukraine after the war. And I deliberately included this symbol, which is sort of the presidential seal of the United States. And I did this because this is a symbol of the bird in the symbol is an eagle, which is the American national bird. And the eagle holds in its claws, as you can see, an olive branch, meaning peace, and then also arrows, meaning preparation for war. And once the war ends, this is what I see as the future of Ukraine, a Ukraine that both maintains its commitment to democracy and maintains its commitment to peace in the sense of not threatening its neighbors, but also a Ukraine which is internally strong and able to defend itself against future attacks. And I think the current war has demonstrated that, especially if Ukraine is armed with NATO weapons and receives other assistance like NATO training, then it can defend itself even against powerful threats. And the good news is that we can see other countries, other democracies in the world who have faced grave external threats, who have been able to survive and deter attacks. I'm thinking of Israel and the Middle East, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. So my hope is to sort of close on an encouraging note in what I know is a very difficult time for everyone. So let me stop there, and Sergey, I turn it back to you. Do you want to? Should we now have questions from the students?
Yes, thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much for these important lessons for our students. And студенти, будь ласка, чи викладачі, можливо, є у кого питання? Задавайте. Яна, будь ласка.
Так, я буду українською. Я нарешті повернулася після того, як пропустила 2 лекції. І в мене є до вас 2 питання. Перше питання. От ви сказали, що є поняття популярної і непопулярних рішень у лідерів. І от ми бачимо, що світові лідери, в них є тенденція невизначеності. Тобто вони неоднозначно підтримують і неоднозначно заперечують такий своєрідний нейтралітет. І от в мене питання, невже для них це бачення такої непопулярного рішення в плані підтримувати Україну і допомогти перемогти швидше? Чому вони трішки так сповільнюють цей процес? Тому що це для них, скажімо так, рішення непопулярне, вони вважають, що можуть, якщо надто підтримуватимуть Україну, лишитися без влади? Це таке моє перше питання.
Sorry, I only switched to English partway, and my interpreter partway through that question. Can someone just summarize what the question was in English? My apologies. Yes, thank you.
How I understand I problem, this is I problem in English, yes? Яна, ти можеш англійською мовою спитати?
Ой, це так довго перекладати, я трішки не зовсім добре перекладаю на англійську. Тому,
The question was why the help could be so slow while the Ukrainians die on fronts.
Yeah, this is a very good question. And I will try to answer it as best I can. The West is very, especially in the United States, is very averse to experiencing American casualties. And, you know, the reason is the United States had just in 2021 ended this war in Afghanistan, which killed thousands of Americans, and we'd gotten out of the war in Iraq. And, you know, President Trump decided to reduce the American presence in Syria, in part because of, you know, American popular opposition to experiencing casualties. And I would say that's probably the case in a number of West European countries. And I'm not, you know, supporting or opposing that. I'm just sort of expressing the sentiment. And so for the West, at least initially, the view was, well, we don't think that we don't want to send troops. We don't want to suffer casualties. We're also concerned that sending troops might lead to direct combat between NATO forces and Russian forces, which might escalate. But perhaps we can send military aid, weapons, and that might be enough to help the Ukrainian forces succeed. And from the Western perspective, this has been a tremendous success in the sense that we've been able to, again, this is from the Western perspective. So, you know, please keep this in mind. From the Western perspective, it's been a great success because we've been able to help Ukraine survive and succeed militarily in battle. And we've been able to do this without experiencing NATO or United States casualties. And that has helped, you know, maintain public support for helping Ukraine. So that is, you know, sort of what I see as the landscape. And from what I've seen, there, you know, there are relatively few people in the United States and NATO who wish to send troops, even now.
Яночка, ваше друге питання давайте.
Можна?
Так, моє друге питання заключається в тому, що, ну, цілком логічно, що вже 21 століття і війна в час глобалізації, гуманізму, коли вже, ну, час еволюції в плані того, що давайте воювати, аби розширювати свої території, є досить неактуальним через те, що ми втрачаємо війська і все тому подібне, і це є прерогативою крайніх методів. Чи можна виправдати популярністю рішення для Росії, таке ганебне, я гадаю, рішення напасти на країну, яка набагато менша, яка набагато слабша, не маючи ніякої загрози для них, і виправдати це лише тим, що це було б популярним рішенням для того, аби Путін і надалі міг утримувати владу і доводити, що Росія велика держава і що це дійсна імперія. Тому що приклади з історії доводять те, що імперії рано чи пізно розпадаються, і війни не завжди триматимуть під собою народ. Іноді народ розуміє, що кровопролиття – це лишнє, і життя набагато дорожче, ніж якась територія, яка ніколи вам не належала навіть історично. Це все. Дякую.
Yeah, these are all very good points. I will try to address them as best I can. You are right that wars to conquer territory are becoming less frequent. And to be honest, I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine will make them even less frequent, because for anyone paying attention, the war has been a complete disaster for Russia. It's been a disaster just from the Russian perspective, never mind the Ukrainian perspective or the war perspective. Russia has had its military power very badly damaged. It's suffering very substantial economic costs, very substantial diplomatic costs. It's almost impossible to imagine, even if the war ended tomorrow with Russian victory, how this could end up providing any kind of economic or political benefit for Russia. And I think other countries like China will look at this and, probably be less likely to consider launching such wars in the future. And as far as, the Russia's ability to sell this as a defensive war, this speaks to the point I made, which is that this is something which dictatorships can do more easily because they control the media. So they're able to, control the narrative and make ridiculous claims that Ukraine wants to invade Russia, that NATO wants to invade Russia, that Ukraine is controlled by Nazis. When you have no other voice within society pushing back against it, it's easier to persuade people that that's actually what's going on. And that, we see this in dictatorships across time. I don't know if you are very familiar with it, but there's a very famous political novel by George Orwell called 1984, which came out in the late 1940s. And that was all about dictatorships selling wars to their populations. And George Orwell sometimes, his book sort of was very forward thinking in understanding how propaganda is used. There's a related question in the chat. I think it's from Oleg, I would like to respond to. And the question is that Russia also uses information platforms in democracies to spread its war propaganda, which greatly harms Ukraine. Is there any way to stop it? I mean, I guess, the one point I would make in response to this good question is the good news is no one in the United States believes these claims made by Russia. No one believes that Ukraine poses any threat to Russia. No one believes that NATO wants to invade Russia. And certainly no one believes that Ukraine is overrun with Nazis. So, that's the good news. And one of the reasons is that in the United States, like in Ukraine, because it's a democracy, we have open media. And so we're able to explain why these are ridiculous claims. And Oleg, and I guess it's Anya, thank you both for your questions.
І у нас ще є одне питання. Ігорі, будь ласка, якраз, я думаю, будемо після цього завершувати.
Thank you for giving me word. Thank you for your election, Mr. Reiter. And I want to add some moments about why dictators organize wars. In the first moment, the dictators want to ravage their opponents in the past, because majority of dictators had no past. For example, Hitler, for example, Putin, and so on. And the second moment is that the people won't be great, great again. For example, Russia won't be great again to own in Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, country of Baltic region, and so on. So, and I think Putin is just the mirror of Russian people who want in reality. They live in past. They don't want to develop technology, intellectual things. They are barbarians, I think.
Mhm.
And that's all. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a very good point. And certainly Putin has this image of what in the West is described as Novo or Novy Rossiya, which is sort of, expanding Russian borders. And Putin has this vision of a larger Russia at Ukraine's expense and the expense of some other neighboring countries. There are certainly people at least some people within Russian society who also embrace this vision. And then the question is, how widespread is this vision? Like, is it the case that the majority of Russians embrace this vision? And the problem is, because it's a dictatorship, that's a difficult question to answer because we cannot do opinion polls. Now, I would agree this is a big problem that amongst dictators. And the other one that we are very concerned about is China, in the sense that there is also clearly surging nationalism within China. China demands to be respected, and China deserves to be seen as a great power. And that also may lead to Chinese aggression. And what the United States is most concerned with is the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So I am also very concerned about this dynamic that in some authoritarian states, the leader and perhaps at least some of the population embrace this sense of greater nationhood or national greatness, by which the country is then entitled to more territory, which then directly leads to military conflict. So I do agree this is a serious problem. I guess my hope, and I don't know if this is right, is that there are a large number of people within Russia who do not embrace this vision, that they do not like the war, that they oppose the war. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of Russian men who are leaving the country rather than serving in the military. And so this gives us some hope that at least large sections of Russian society reject this vision of a new Russian empire. So that is sort of closing on sort of maybe an optimistic observation or hope.
So our time is finished now. Then thank you very much for this important lections and for your time. Okay.
Thank you very much for your attention. I very much appreciate it, and I've enjoyed this opportunity to speak with all of you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Дякую
Thank you.
всім
Have a
колегам.
nice day.
До наступної зустрічі.
До зустрічі.